The sharp sound of braking and the smell of burning rubber cut through the night air in Seoul. Han Jae-soo felt his body move on instinct, throwing himself at the distracted man crossing the street. The two of them rolled across the asphalt, missing the speeding car by centimeters, leaving only the echo of the driver's horn and swear words. "Are you all right?" Jae-soo asked, his heart still racing, as he stood up and held out his hand to the man. His eyes met a young, chiseled face, wearing a suit that, despite the fall, still retained a certain elegance. "Thanks to you," he replied, accepting the help to get up. "I'm Kim Min-jae. I can't thank you enough." Jae-soo smiled, straightening his own now dust-stained cafeteria uniform. "No need to thank me. Anyone would do the same." She noticed a small cut on his hand. "There's a pharmacy nearby. We should take care of it." In the pharmacy in the Hongdae district, as Jae-soo skillfully cleaned Min-jae's wound, she didn't notice the curious looks he was giving her. For him, there was something magnetic about the natural, detached way she treated him. "So you work around here?" Min-jae asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes, at the Sweet Haven coffee shop, a few blocks from here." Jae-soo finished dressing. "It's a small place, but it has the best chocolate cake in town. At least that's what our loyal customers say." What Jae-soo didn't know was that Min-jae already knew Sweet Haven very well. In fact, the building where the cafe operated was just one of dozens of properties that his company, MJ Group, was planning to demolish to build a new shopping center. Over the next few days, Min-jae began to frequent the cafe. Always dressed in simple clothes, he presented himself as an ordinary office worker. The small cafe, with its exposed brick walls and hanging plants, became his refuge from the pressures of corporate life. During his visits, he observed Jae-soo interacting with the customers, an elderly woman who came every morning for her tea, university students who spent hours studying, and a group of street artists who gathered on Thursday afternoons. Each person received a genuine smile and sincere attention from her. Park Seo-jun, the cafe's pastry chef and Jae-soo's childhood friend, noticed the new customers' frequent visits. "That guy has been coming in every day this week," he commented to Jae-soo while preparing a new batch of cookies. "He seems to like our coffee," Jae-soo replied, trying to ignore the heat rising in her cheeks. "The coffee or the barista?" Seo-jun teased, earning himself a pat on the shoulder with the tea towel. The routine continued for a few weeks, with Min-jae and Jae-soo developing a friendship that was slowly beginning to show signs of something deeper. He learned that she lived with her sick grandmother, that she worked in the cafe to pay for her photography studies, and that her biggest dream was to open her own art gallery. One evening, after the coffee shop had closed, Min-jae waited for Jae-soo. "Can I walk you home?" On the way, they passed a street exhibition. Jae-soo's eyes lit up when he saw the photographs. "It's amazing how one image can tell so many different stories," she commented, stopping in front of a photo showing two old hands intertwined. Min-jae observed not the photographs, but the way her face lit up as she talked about art. At that moment, the weight of her secret became even heavier. Back in his office on the roof of the MJ Group building, Min-jae stared at the model of the new shopping center. In the plan, Sweet Haven and all the small businesses around it were nothing more than spaces to be replaced. "So, the acquisition documents are ready for your signature," his assistant Choi Yuna informed him, placing a folder on his desk. Min-jae touched the papers, remembering Jae-soo's smile, the community that gathered in the cafeteria, the stories that small space held. For the first time in his career, a business decision didn't seem so clear-cut. "I need more time to review it," he replied, turning his chair towards the window that offered a panoramic view of Seoul. That night, in his luxurious apartment in Gangnam, Min-jae couldn't sleep. His late father's words echoed in his mind. "Business is business. Feelings have no place in corporate decisions." But every time he thought of Jae-soo, of his honesty and simplicity, something inside him rebelled against these principles. Min-jae's internal conflict grew every day, as did his feelings for Jae-soo. He knew he had to make a decision: keep his identity a secret and carry on with the company's plans, or reveal the truth and risk losing not only $1 million project, but also the trust of the only person who had made him feel truly human in years. The MJ Group board meeting was underway on the 50th floor of the imposing skyscraper in Gangnam. Menjae gazed out through the glass panels at the city below, while his chief financial officer presented the figures for the development project. With the acquisition of the Hongdae district, our projected profits will increase by 45% in the next quarter, he explained, pointing to elaborate graphs. We just need to finalize the purchase of the last establishments. Menjae thought about Sweet Haven and how that little cafe had become more than just a number on his spreadsheets. What about the current businesses in the area? He asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Mostly family establishments, so nothing we can't handle with the appropriate compensation. After the meeting, Menjae drove his own car to Hongdae, swapping his suit for casual clothes in the back seat, a ritual that had become frequent in recent weeks. When he entered Sweet Haven, he found Jisoo organizing a new exhibition of photographs on the walls. Are these yours? He asked, moving closer to examine the black and white images. Yes, she replied, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. Mrs. Park let me display some of them here. They're mostly portraits of our regular customers. Menjae looked at each photograph with genuine attention. One showed the morning tea lady smiling over her steaming cup. Another captured the moment when Seojun was testing a new recipe, the concentration evident on his flour-covered face. You have a gift for capturing the essence of people, he commented, pausing in front of a particularly touching photo of two children sharing a cookie. It's because this place is special, Jisoo explained, adjusting the last frame. Every person who walks through that door has a story, and somehow all those stories intertwine here. At that moment, Mrs. Park, the owner of the coffee shop, approached with a slight limp. Ah, Minji SSI, how nice to see you. Come, I need your opinion on our new coffee blend. Mrs. Park, a woman in her 60s with a kind smile and keen eyes, had adopted Menjae as one of her favorite customers. What she didn't know was that her notification letters from MJ Group were already being prepared. As she sipped her coffee, Menjae listened to Mrs. Park tell how she had inherited the coffee shop from her late husband, transforming it from a simple snack bar into a meeting place for the local community. You know, young man, sometimes the real value of things can't be measured in one, she said, as if she could read his thoughts. Later that evening, Menjae invited Jisoo for a walk after his shift. They walked to a small park nearby, where street artists were performing under the colored lights. What's it like working in an office? Jisoo asked suddenly. You never talk much about your work. Menjae felt his stomach turn. It's ordinary. A lot of paperwork, he replied vaguely, quickly changing the subject. And your grandmother, how is she? Better, thanks to the new medicines. But they're expensive, Jisoo sighed, taking a seat on a nearby bench. That's why I've been working overtime in the cafeteria. Mrs. Park has been very understanding. The weight of guilt pressed even harder on Menji's chest. He could easily solve Jisoo's financial problems, but that would mean revealing who he really was, and consequently, the plans his company had for Sweet Haven. Back in his office the next morning, Menjae found his assistant, Yuna, with a worried expression. Sir, the board is questioning the delay in signing the acquisition documents. Tell them I'm carrying out a final assessment of the project's social impact, he replied, surprised at his own words. Social impact? Yuna repeated, confused. That wasn't in the original scope. Menjae spent the afternoon reviewing alternatives for the project. Perhaps there was a way to preserve Sweet Haven and other historic establishments within the new development, but each modification meant millions in lost profits, and he knew the council would not easily approve such changes. Meanwhile, at Sweet Haven, Seojun watched Jisoo with concern. You're getting too involved with that client, he warned, as they prepared to close. Don't be silly, Jisoo replied, but his smile when he saw a message from Menjae on his cell phone betrayed his feelings. Just be careful, Seojun insisted. There's something about him. I can't explain it. Like he's keeping some kind of secret. Seojun's words echoed in Jisoo's mind as she organized the last few tables. It was true that there was a lot about Menjae that remained a mystery, but there was also a genuineness in his gestures, a kindness in his gaze that she couldn't doubt. What neither of them knew was that time was running out. In a few days, The official notifications from MJ Group would start arriving, and the fragile balance Menjay had built between their two worlds was about to crumble. That evening, in his luxurious apartment, Menjay stared out at the illuminated city. His cell phone vibrated with the message from Jisoo, a photo of the last batch of cookies of the night, accompanied by a smiling emoji. In the background, he could see the photo mural that told the stories of Sweet Haven and its people. It was then that Menjay realized he wasn't just in love with Jisoo, he was in love with everything she stood for. Authenticity, community, the kind of human connection that no corporate venture could replicate. The question was, would he be brave enough to fight for it? The white envelope from MJ Group arrived at Sweet Haven on a rainy Tuesday. Mrs. Park held it with trembling hands as she read its contents. Sitting at one of the cafeteria's empty tables, Jisoo watched her expression gradually change, the gentle smile giving way to deep concern. "What happened?" Jisoo asked, approaching with a cup of tea for his boss. "They want to buy the building," Mrs. Park replied, her voice low and distant. "A big corporation, the MJ Group. They plan to build a shopping center here." The name of the company made Seo Jun, who was standing near the counter, look up from the cake he was decorating. "MJ Group? That business giant?" Jisoo took the paper from Mrs. Park's hands, his eyes running over the formal language of the document. "But they can't just kick us out, can they?" "Technically they can," Mrs. Park sighed. "The lease expires in 2 months. They're offering compensation, but..." At that very moment, Menjay was in his office, staring at the computer screen that showed the status of the notifications sent. His heart squeezed when he saw that Sweet Haven was among the establishments that had already received the notice. His assistant, Yuna, entered the room with more documents. "Sir, the first responses have started to come in. Some owners have already accepted the offer." Menjay just nodded, his mind wandering to Jisoo and how she would react when she found out. The sound of the phone brought him back to reality. It was his older brother, Jun. "I hear you're holding up the project in Hongdae," Juno said bluntly. "The board is restless, Menjay. Dad didn't build this empire for you to hesitate at the crucial moment." His brother's words weighed like lead. Menjay knew he had to make a decision, and fast. That afternoon, he decided to go to the coffee shop, even though he knew it would be different now. As he entered Sweet Haven, he immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. The usual cheerful atmosphere had been replaced by a palpable tension. A few regular customers chatted quietly, occasionally glancing at Mrs. Park, who tried to maintain a brave smile. Jisoo greeted him as usual, but there was something different in her eyes. "You won't believe it," she began, as she prepared her usual coffee. "A big company wants to demolish our building." Menjay felt his stomach turn. "Is that so?" he managed to say, his voice huskier than usual. "Sweet Haven is more than a coffee shop," Jisoo continued, his hands working automatically on the coffee machine. "It's a home for many people. How can they just destroy it?" As she spoke, Menjay noticed the photographs on the walls. Those same images that Jisoo had captured so lovingly. Each one told a story, preserved a moment, a memory that would be lost. "Maybe," he began hesitantly, "maybe there's a way to save the place." Jisoo looked at him hopefully. "How?" Before he could answer, Seo Jun appeared with a serious expression. "Hey Jisoo, you need to see this." He held up his cell phone, showing a page of financial news. "I found more information about MJ Group and its CEO Kim Menjay." Menjay's blood ran cold. He watched, paralyzed. As Jisoo leaned over to look at the screen, his eyes widened when he saw the corporate photo of him in his impeccable suit, so different from the casual clothes he wore in the coffee shop. "But that can't." Jisoo alternated his gaze between the photo on his cell phone and the man in front of him. Comprehension slowly took over his expression. "Just so I can explain," Menjay began, standing up. She took a step back. "All this time, did you know? Did you know they were going to demolish our cafe?" The silence that followed was deafening. Other customers began to sense the tension, turning their attention to the scene that was unfolding. "I wanted to tell you," Menjay tried to explain, his voice low and urgent. "But the more time I spent here, the more More you what?" Jisoo interrupted, tears starting to form in his eyes. "Did you take the opportunity to study how it would be easier to destroy us?" Mrs. Park, who was watching everything from her usual table, slowly stood up. "So that's why you came here every day," she said, her voice filled not with anger, but with deep disappointment. Min-jae felt the weight of all the stares on him. Every familiar face in the cafe now stared at him with a mixture of shock and betrayal. The place that had become his refuge now seemed suffocating. "Please let me explain," he tried again. But Seo-jun was already between him and Jisoo, like a protective shield. "I think you'd better leave," Seo-jun said firmly. Min-jae took one last look at Jisoo, desperately wanting to make her understand, but the words died in his throat. With one last look at the photographs on the walls, images of a community he had learned to love and was now about to destroy, he left the cafe. The rain had started again outside, but Min-jae barely noticed as he walked back to his car. His phone rang again. Another call from the board, another demand about the project, another reminder of his responsibilities as CEO. Inside Sweet Haven, Jisoo discreetly wiped away her tears as Mrs. Park hugged her. "Sometimes," the elderly woman whispered, "people aren't who they pretend to be. But sometimes they're not just who you think they are either." In the luxurious penthouse of the MJ Group building, Min-jae sat in his office long after business hours. The city of Seoul sparkled below, but his thoughts were fixed on the small cafe in Hongdae and Jisoo's hurt look. "Sir?" Yuna interrupted his thoughts, entering the room with a briefcase. "The council has scheduled an emergency meeting for tomorrow. Your brother June is especially worried about the rumors about your frequent visits to Hongdae." Min-jae adjusted his tie, feeling it tighter than usual. "I've cancelled more important appointments than that," he replied dryly. "With all due respect, sir," Yuna hesitated, "but the photos are already circulating on social media. The CEO of MJ Group going incognito to one of the establishments he intends to demolish. The press has started speculating." Meanwhile, at Sweet Haven, Jisoo was mechanically organizing the tables for the closing. The photographs on the walls now seemed charged with a different kind of sadness. Every moment captured would soon be just a memory. "You need to eat something," Seo-jun insisted, placing a plate with a piece of chocolate cake in front of him. "I haven't seen you eat all day." How could he, Seo-jun? Jisoo finally let the tears fall. Every smile, every conversation, was it all a lie? Mrs. Park, who was watching the scene from the kitchen, approached with a limp. "Things aren't always as simple as they seem, dear. I saw how that boy looked at you at this place. There was truth there." "Truth?" Jisoo laughed bitterly. "He's the CEO of the company that's going to destroy our home." That evening, Min-jae drove to a small Buddhist temple in the mountains outside Seoul. It was where his father used to take him when he needed to make important decisions. The older monk, who had known the family for decades, found him contemplating the garden. "Problems of the heart are always more complex than business problems," the monk commented, taking a seat next to him. "How can I choose between my father's legacy and—" Min-jae paused, unable to complete the sentence. "Perhaps the real question is, which legacy do you want to leave?" The next morning, Sweet Haven was surprisingly full. Regular customers and new faces had appeared in solidarity after the news of the demolition had spread. Among them was Kim Juno, who watched everything with clinical interest as he sipped his Americano. "So this is where my little brother has been spending his time," he muttered to himself, his calculating eyes studying every detail of his surroundings. Jisoo, who didn't know him, approached to pick up his empty cup. "Can I get you anything else?" "No thanks. Just trying to understand what makes this place so special," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. At the MJ Group headquarters, the boardroom was packed. Min-jae entered last, carrying a thick briefcase and a determined expression that was very reminiscent of his father. "Before we start," he announced, "I'd like to present an alternative proposal for the Hongdae project." "Alternative?" one of the older counselors questioned. "The project is already underway." Min-jae projected a new plan on the screen. "Instead of demolishing, we can renovate, turn the area into a cultural district while preserving local businesses. The studies show significant tourism potential." The presentation continued for an hour, with Min-jae passionately defending his vision. When he finished, the silence in the room was heavy. "This will reduce our profits by 30%, June pointed out, leafing through the reports. But it will create sustainable value in the long term, Min-jae countered. And it will keep the soul of the neighborhood intact. Back at Sweet Haven, Jisoo found an envelope in his locker. Inside was a letter from Min-jae and documents from MJ Group. His hands were shaking as he read it. Jisoo, I lied about who I was but never about what I felt. This place, you have changed the way I see the world. I don't ask for your forgiveness, just the chance to prove that people can change, that companies can be more than numbers. Before he could finish reading, the door to the cafeteria opened. It was Min-jae, this time wearing his full corporate suit. I know I asked you to leave, Mrs. Park said, getting up from her usual chair. But something tells me you have something important to tell us. The atmosphere became tense as everyone present, employees, regular customers, Seo-jun and especially Jisoo, waited for her words. It was time for the truth, and Min-jae knew there was no turning back. In Sweet Haven's meeting room, now closed to customers, Min-jae stood in front of everyone. The silence was thick as he opened his executive briefcase, pulling out a series of documents. What I'm going to show you now is a completely different proposal for the future of this place, he began, his voice firm but charged with emotion. I haven't come as the CEO of MJ Group, but as someone who has learned the true meaning of community between these walls. Mrs. Park adjusted her glasses, examining the papers Min-jae was handing out. Jisoo stood back, arms crossed, but her eyes couldn't help but follow his every move. Instead of demolishing, I propose turning this area into a preserved cultural district, Min-jae continued, unrolling architectural plans on the table. Sweet Haven would be the heart of this project, expanding to include a community art gallery and performance spaces. Seo-jun, who until then had maintained a skeptical expression, leaned over to take a closer look at the drawings. What about the other establishments? Each current business would be given priority to remain, with long-term leases at controlled prices, Min-jae explained. MJ Group would invest in restoring the buildings, keeping their original architecture, but modernizing the facilities. Jisoo finally approached, his eyes catching a specific detail on the blueprints. That's a photography gallery, Min-jae added softly, his eyes meeting hers. Inspired by your photos, Jisoo, you always said you wanted a space for local artists to show their work. Mrs. Park coughed slightly, breaking the moment between them. This all looks very nice on paper, Min-jae SSI. But why should we trust you now? Because I've already put my career on the line for this project, he replied. The MJ Group board is divided. My own brother is strongly opposed to this change of direction, but for the first time in my life, I'm fighting for something I truly believe in. Just then, the door to the cafeteria opened, and June walked in, accompanied by two executives. So this is where you're hiding our dear CEO, he announced with a cold smile. June. Min-jae turned around tense. This is a private meeting. Private? June laughed, picking up one of the plants from the table. Nothing involving MJ Group is private, little brother. The board is waiting for your final decision on the original project. The tension in the room increased as the brothers stared at each other. Jisoo observed the dynamic, beginning to better understand the pressures Min-jae was facing. I've already made my decision, Min-jae declared firmly. The project will be reformulated on the terms I have just presented, or I will resign my position as CEO. A murmur of surprise ran through the room. June visibly paled. You can't be serious, he hissed. Think of what our father would say. Our father taught us to value profit above all else, Min-jae replied, his voice calm but determined. But here in this cafe, I've learned that there are different ways of measuring success. Mrs. Park stood up slowly, leaning on her cane. Your father used to come here, you know, she said softly, surprising everyone. A long time ago, before MJ Group became what it is today, he would sit at that table by the window and say that this place reminded him of his humble roots. June seemed disconcerted by this information. Min-jae looked at the table mentioned, imagining his father there, perhaps dreaming of the empire he would build. Sometimes, Mrs. Park continued, we need to lose something valuable in order to remember what really matters. Your brother seems to have learned that lesson, June SSI. Perhaps it's time for you to honor your father's legacy in a different way. Seo-jun, who had remained silent, finally spoke up. If we're going to do this, we need to make sure that the whole community is protected, not just Sweet Haven. I agree, Min-jae nodded, pulling more documents out of his briefcase. That's why I've prepared individual agreements for each establishment on the block, transparent, legally binding, and with real guarantees. Jisoo finally approached Min-jae, her eyes meeting his. Why didn't you tell me before? Why did you keep it a secret for so long? Because when I met you, I realized I was living in a bubble, he answered sincerely. Every day here showed me more clearly how wrong I was about many things. I needed to fully understand this place, this community, before I could fight for it properly. The meeting stretched into the night, with every detail being discussed and fine-tuned. June ended up leaving early, visibly upset, but not without first casting a thoughtful glance at the table where his father used to sit. When they finally finished, the light of dawn was beginning to tint the Seoul sky. Mrs. Park prepared a final round of coffee for everyone, served in the special cups reserved for important occasions. To new beginnings, she toasted, raising her cup. It was a moment of transformation not only for Sweet Haven, but for everyone present, especially for Min-jae and Jisoo, who would still need to navigate the complex path between forgiveness and trust, but now with a new understanding of each other and the future they could build together. The morning sun bathed Hongdae as the first signs for the renovation began to be installed. Sweet Haven Cultural District, an MJ Group project in partnership with the local community, announced the colorful panels. Jisoo photographed every moment, documenting the transformation not only of the neighborhood, but of his own conflicting emotions. I still can't believe this is actually happening, commented Seo-jun, watching the workers carefully working to preserve the building's historic facade. Sweet Haven remained open during the renovation, albeit with reduced opening hours. Mrs. Park had insisted on this, arguing that her regular customers needed continuity. In fact, the cafe had become an even more important meeting place, with locals coming to discuss the changes and share their hopes and concerns. Min-jae showed up regularly, no longer in disguise, but still keeping a low profile. He made a point of attending community meetings, listening attentively to every suggestion and concern. His presence caused an initial stir, but gradually, people began to see beyond the CEO of MJ Group. Mr. Kim has been surprisingly approachable, an elderly woman commented to Jisoo as she poured her morning tea. Just yesterday he spent an hour discussing how to preserve the centenary trees in the square. Jisoo just nodded, still struggling with his mixed feelings. He watched Min-jae from afar, noticing how he seemed lighter, more authentic. Even in his impeccable suit, the lies of the past still hurt, but it was impossible to deny the sincerity of his present actions. One afternoon, while organizing his photographs for the future gallery, Jisoo came across an old picture of Min-jae on his first day at the coffee shop. His smile was genuine, his eyes bright. It was the same look he had now when he talked about the revitalization project. Some people lie to hide who they are. Mrs. Park's voice came from behind her. Others lie because they haven't figured out who they really are yet. In her office at MJ Group, Min-jae was facing her own battles. June had mobilized part of the board against the project, arguing that the company was abandoning its fundamental principles. The preliminary figures are in, Yuna reported, handing over a folder. Tourist interest in the district has already increased by 40% since the revitalization was announced. Min-jae smiled, picking up his phone to share the news with the Hongdae community. He stopped when he saw a message from Jisoo, a photo of the old Sweet Haven sign being carefully restored, accompanied by the words, "Some old things deserve a second chance." The following week, during a particularly busy afternoon at the cafe, a group of international executives arrived unannounced. They were representatives of an important cultural preservation organization. "We heard about the project," one of them explained in English. "It's rare to see a large corporation prioritize community preservation in this way." Jisoo, who was photographing the meeting, observed how Min-jae conducted the conversation with humility, always redirecting the praise to the local community. At one point, their gazes met, and she realized that she was smiling unconsciously. "You know," Seo-jun commented later, preparing the dough for his famous cookies. Sometimes people need to lose themselves to find their true path. Since when did you get so philosophical? Jisoo teased, but his words resonated. In the evening after closing, Min-jae showed up with updated plans for the photography gallery. Jisoo was alone, finalizing the checkout. "I thought you'd like to see the modifications," he said softly, keeping a respectful distance. As they examined the drawings together, the physical proximity made it difficult to ignore the emotional tension between them. Every little detail of the project showed how Min-jae had paid attention to everything she had mentioned about her dream. "Why do you care so much?" Jisoo finally asked, his voice only a whisper. "Because you showed me a world beyond spreadsheets and profits," Min-jae replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Here, I learned that success can be measured by customers' smiles, by preserving memories, by building something meaningful." The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of rain starting outside. It was as if the universe was recreating the night they met. "I still have the bandage," Min-jae confessed, taking out his wallet and showing the small band-aid tucked away carefully, "to remind me of the moment when someone cared about me for who I was, not what I had." Jisoo felt tears forming in his eyes. The anger and hurt she had harbored began to dissolve, replaced by a deeper understanding. "Coffee's ready," she said, breaking the moment. "Would you like to try the new blend that Mrs. Park created?" It was a small step, a shared cup of coffee in a coffee shop under renovation, but it represented something bigger. The possibility of rebuilding, not just a neighborhood, but trust and affection. An unexpected discovery shook up Sweet Haven's routine when, during restoration work, workers found an old metal box hidden behind one of the walls. Mrs. Park immediately recognized the handwriting on the yellowed envelope inside. It was from her late husband. "These are the original recipes," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she held the aged papers. "And letters to our daughter." Jisoo, who was helping to organize the documents in the cafe, approached curiously. She had never heard Mrs. Park mention a daughter before. "She left a long time ago," Mrs. Park explained, sitting down heavily. "Disagreements about the future of the cafe. She wanted to sell, modernize. We ended up drifting apart." Min-jae, who was supervising the works that morning, watched the scene with interest. The discovery seemed to echo his own family history. The expectations, the conflicts between tradition and progress. "Do you have any contact with her?" he asked gently. "I heard she opened her own chain of coffee shops in Busan," Mrs. Park replied, a mixture of pride and sadness in her voice. "Sweet Dreams Cafe. I've never had the courage to visit." Seo-jun and Jisoo exchanged meaningful glances. Sweet Dreams was one of MJ Group's biggest competitors in the coffee sector. June had mentioned the possibility of a takeover at several meetings. That evening, after closing, Min-jae found Jisoo organizing his photographs for the future gallery. Among the images was a new series focusing on the architectural details that were being revealed during the renovation. "It's amazing how each layer removed tells a different story," Jisoo commented, showing a particularly touching photo of the old facade being carefully restored. "Like people," Min-jae replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Sometimes we need to deconstruct in order to rebuild something truer." The moment was interrupted by a call on Min-jae's cell phone. It was June. "We need to talk." His brother's voice sounded tense. "It's about Sweet Dreams Cafe." The next day, while Mrs. Park was at her routine doctor's appointment, Jisoo decided to do some research on Sweet Dreams. The photos showed modern and personal surroundings, so different from the cozy atmosphere of Sweet Haven. "Park Min-seo," she read out the CEO's name. Mrs. Park's daughter. Seo-jun, who was preparing a new batch of cookies, stopped when he heard the name. "Maybe it's time for some bridges to be rebuilt," he suggested, his meaningful gaze going beyond the physical works of the cafe. At the MJ Group headquarters, Min-jae stared across the meeting table at his brother. "Min-seo wants to sell Sweet Dreams," June announced, "and she knows about our project in Hongdae." "What exactly does she want?" Min-jae asked, already anticipating the answer. "To meet you and her mother?" The news of the possible family reunion shook Sweet Haven. Mrs. Park alternated between anxiety and hope, compulsively rearranging the old family photographs she kept in her office. What if she doesn't forgive me? The elderly woman confessed her fears to Jisoo as she helped her choose a dress for the meeting. Sometimes forgiveness starts with small gestures, Jisoo replied, thinking back to her own journey with Min-jae. Like a shared cup of coffee, the meeting was arranged for a Sunday. Before the coffee shop opened, Min-jae had suggested an elegant restaurant, but Mrs. Park insisted it be there. Where it all began, Min-seo arrived punctually at 9 a.m., her high heels echoing on the newly restored wooden floor. She stopped when she saw the old photographs on the walls, including one of herself as a teenager, helping in the kitchen. "You kept the photos?" she commented softly. "I always kept everything that was important," her mother replied, her voice trembling slightly. Min-jae, who was discreetly observing the scene with Jisoo, noticed how mother and daughter shared the same determined look, the same dignified posture even in moments of vulnerability. "I came to talk about business," Min-seo began, but her words lost their force when she smelled the familiar aroma of the chocolate cookies her father used to make. Seo-jun had prepared the original recipe found in the box. "Your recipe is still here," Mrs. Park said, serving a still warm cookie. "Just like your place." The tears that Min-seo had been trying to hold back finally escaped. Years of resentment and wounded pride began to melt like hot chocolate. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered. "I was so focused on proving my worth that I forgot the value of what we already had here." Jisoo discreetly photographed the moment, capturing the hesitant embrace that turned into a profound encounter between mother and daughter. Min-jae, beside her, thought of her own father and the different ways of honoring a legacy. "Maybe," Min-seo said later, after hours of conversation and several cups of coffee, "it's time to join forces instead of competing." His proposal was simple: transform Sweet Dreams into a modern extension of Sweet Haven, preserving the family essence, but adapting it for new times. A perfect reflection of the revitalization project Min-jae was undertaking. "Like water and coffee," Mrs. Park smiled, using one of her favorite analogies. Different but made to complement each other. News of the reconciliation between Mrs. Park and Min-seo spread quickly through Hongdae, bringing a new wave of optimism to the revitalization project. While mother and daughter worked together to integrate the Sweet Dreams concepts into the Sweet Haven tradition, Min-jae faced her own family challenges. "The board is divided," June informed her over a tense dinner at the Shilla Hotel restaurant. "Half support his vision for Hongdae, the other half want to keep the original demolition plan." Min-jae watched his older brother, noticing the deep circles under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. "He looked tired, Hyun." "I spent the week going through Dad's old projects," June admitted, surprising Min-jae. "I found something interesting in the archives." He slid an old folder across the table. Inside were sketches of a project similar to the one Min-jae was proposing for Hongdae, dating back 20 years. His father's signature was in the bottom corner, along with notes on cultural preservation and sustainable development. "Why didn't he ever implement it?" Min-jae asked, studying the details of the abandoned project. "The investors at the time didn't believe in his vision," June replied, a sad smile playing on her lips. "Maybe you're realizing more than just your own dream, little brother." At Sweet Haven, Jisoo was organizing a special exhibition with old photographs of the cafe, including some newly discovered ones in the memory box. Among them, one particularly caught her eye. It showed Mrs. Park's father serving coffee to a young businessman. "That's your father?" Mrs. Park commented, quietly approaching. "Kim Sung-ho used to frequent the coffee shop when he was starting MJ Group. He said the coffee here helped him think better." Jisoo felt a shiver run down his spine. The connections between the families seemed woven by fate, intertwined like the aromas of coffee and chocolate that always filled the air at Sweet Haven. Min-seo, who was now spending more time in the cafe, brought a unique perspective to the renovation project. His experience with Sweet Dreams perfectly complemented Sweet Haven's tradition. "We can create a space that honors the past while embracing the future," she explained during a meeting, her eyes shining with genuine enthusiasm. "Imagine marble tables next to restored vintage furniture, discreet technology serving traditional comfort." Seo-jun, initially skeptical about the changes, began to get excited about the culinary possibilities. We could expand the menu while keeping the classics, he suggested, already planning fusions between traditional recipes and modern techniques. One afternoon, while supervising the installation of new equipment in the kitchen, Jisoo found Menjay admiring the photo of his father on the wall. He used to say that great empires are built on small moments of inspiration, Menjay commented, his voice soft and reflective. I never fully understood what he meant until I got to know this place. And now? Jisoo asked, approaching hesitantly. I realize now that he wasn't talking about building buildings or expanding businesses, Menjay replied, turning to face her. He was talking about building connections, creating spaces where stories can happen. The moment was interrupted by Mensio, who entered carrying old boxes from his apartment in Busan. I found some more relics, she announced, placing the boxes on the counter. Among yellowed photographs and old documents, there was a handwritten recipe book. The pages were stained with coffee and chronicled the evolution of Sweet Haven over the decades, each recipe accompanied by little personal notes. I remember Dad writing in this notebook every night, Mrs. Park said, flipping through the pages reverently. He used to say that every cup of coffee tells a different story. As everyone gathered around the notebook, sharing memories and planning for the future, Menjay received an urgent message from Yuna. The council had scheduled a final vote on the project for the following week. We need to show them, Menjay said, an idea beginning to form. Not just the numbers and projections, but the true essence of what we're trying to preserve. In the days that followed, Sweet Haven became a living archive of stories. Jisoo documented testimonials from past customers. Mensio compiled data on the coffee shop's cultural impact on the community. And Seojun prepared a special menu that told the story of the place through flavors. It's more than just a corporate presentation, Menjay explained during a planning meeting. It's about showing how the past and the future can coexist, how tradition and innovation can strengthen each other. Sweet Haven's transformation was becoming a symbol of something greater. The possibility of growth without losing its essence, of change without destruction, of progress that honors its roots. The MJ Group boardroom buzzed with excitement as the board members settled down for the decisive vote. Menjay had transformed the traditionally austere corporate environment. On the walls, large-format photographs captured by Jisoo showed the pulsating life of Sweet Haven and the Hongdae neighborhood. This is highly unconventional, muttered one of the older board members, adjusting his glasses to examine a particularly touching image of a family celebrating a birthday in the cafeteria. June, surprising everyone, stood up first. Before my brother's presentation, I'd like to share something. He projected his father's found sketches onto the main screen. This isn't just Minji's project. It's the realization of a dream that our father couldn't fulfill. The silence that followed was profound. Menjay felt his heart race as he watched the advisor's expressions subtly change. It was the first time he had seen his older brother truly by his side. Meanwhile, at Sweet Haven, Jisoo was organizing an impromptu exhibition of the photographs that hadn't been taken to MJ Group. Mensio, who was now spending more time in the cafe, helped position the pictures. It's amazing how you can capture the essence of people, Mensio commented, looking at a particularly expressive photograph of his mother smiling while making coffee. I see both regret and hope in her eyes. Sometimes we need to see our story through the eyes of others to understand it better, Jisoo replied, thinking of how his photographs of Menjay had changed over time, revealing deeper and deeper layers of her personality. At MJ Group's headquarters, Menji's presentation was reaching its crucial moment. He didn't just bring figures and projections, but real stories. Each slide was accompanied by video testimonials from residents, traders, and regulars in the neighborhood. The true value of a business can't just be measured in wins, Menjay argued, his voice firm and passionate. It should be measured by the positive impact it has on people's lives. Mrs. Park appeared on the screen, sitting in her usual chair at Sweet Haven. This place isn't just a coffee shop, she said in the video, her voice laced with emotion. It's a piece of Seoul's history, a place where generations meet and where dreams can still flourish. The council watched in respectful silence. Even the most skeptical members seemed touched by the authenticity of the testimonies. When Mensio appeared on the screen, talking about how reconciliation with her mother had changed her view of tradition and modernity. Several counselors exchanged meaningful glances. Back at Sweet Haven, Seo-jun was experimenting with new recipes that combined traditional elements with modern techniques. "It's like our own metaphor," he commented to Jisoo, presenting a croissant filled with red bean jam. "The best of both worlds." Jisoo's phone vibrated. It was a message from Menjae. "Voting will start in 5 minutes. Wish me luck." Attached was a picture of the boardroom, where their photographs created a mosaic of life and memories on the corporate walls. "Some battles are won with strategy," Ms. Park said, noticing Jisoo's anxiety. "Others with heart. Menjae seems to have learned how to use both." At MJ Group, each vote was recorded in tense silence. Juno, sitting next to his brother, kept a neutral expression, but his hand occasionally touched the pocket where he kept an old family photo. "With 10 votes in favor and 3 against," announced the council president, "the Hongdae Revitalization Project is approved, with the modifications proposed by Kim Menjae." The relief was immediate, but the celebration restrained. After all, they were still in a corporate environment. Menjae exchanged a meaningful glance with his brother, years of competition and disagreements beginning to dissolve. When Menjae arrived at Sweet Haven that evening, he found the place decorated with soft lights and tables set up for a small celebration. Jisoo was waiting for him at the entrance, camera in hand. "We need to document this moment," she said. But before she could take the picture, Menjae gently lowered the camera. "Some memories," he said softly, "deserve to be lived first, photographed later." The evening progressed with stories being shared, plans being made, and old wounds beginning to heal. Men Seo and her mother served coffee, using both vintage Sweet Haven cups and modern Sweet Dreams cups, a silent symbol of togetherness and transformation. As he watched the scene, Menjae realized that he had built something much more valuable than a corporate empire. He had helped weave new threads into a tapestry of relationships and memories that would continue far beyond any real estate project. The sound of hammers and chainsaws filled the air in Hongdae as the transformation of the neighborhood took shape. Sweet Haven stood as an oasis of calm amidst the renovation, its exposed brick walls now lovingly restored, preserving the marks of time while embracing the new. Menjae watched the work from the window of his temporary office, housed in a modernized container on the plot next to the cafe. His decision to personally oversee the project had surprised many at MJ Group, but he knew he needed to be close to ensure that every detail respected the essence of the place. "The architects have finalized the design of the gallery," Yuna informed him, walking in with a folder of documents. "They've incorporated all of Jisoo's suggestions about natural lighting and flexible spaces." The mention of her name made Menjae smile involuntarily. In recent days, their meetings had become more frequent, but also more complex. Each conversation seemed laden with unspoken words, with possibilities hanging in the air like the smoke from freshly brewed coffee. At Sweet Haven, Jisoo was working with Men Seo to curate the photographs that would decorate the renovated space. The dynamic between them had evolved from initial caution to a creative partnership, their different perspectives complementing each other in unexpected ways. "This one," Men Seo pointed to a black and white photograph of her father working on the old coffee machine, "should be the centerpiece of the inaugural exhibition. It's where it all began." Seo-jun, who was passing by with a tray of freshly baked croissants, stopped to look at the picture. "Do you know what would be interesting? Recreating this photo with you and your mother on the new machine. Past and present, tradition and innovation." The idea resonated with everyone. Mrs. Park, who was organizing the new menu with a mix of old and contemporary recipes, looked up with interest. "We could do a series like this, showing the evolution of Sweet Haven through the generations." The revitalization project had become more than a simple renovation. It was a reconciliation between eras, between people, between different visions of the future. June, who had initially opposed the changes, now visited regularly, bringing valuable insights from her corporate experience. "Investors are impressed with the concept," he commented during an informal meeting in the cafeteria. "Some other companies have already shown interest in replicating the model in other historic neighborhoods." Menjae, who was absent-mindedly stirring his coffee, noticed how his brother seemed more relaxed there, far from the aseptic meeting rooms of MJ Group. Maybe Dad always knew that we needed to find our own way to make his dream come true. In the evening, after closing time, Jisoo found Menjae still working on the container. She was carrying 2 cups of the new special blend that Seojun had created, a fusion of traditional beans with modern roasting techniques. "I thought you might need a break," she said, placing a cup on her makeshift table. The rich, complex aroma filled the space, bringing back memories of the past few months. "Thank you," Menjae replied, his fingers lightly brushing hers as he picked up the cup. The brief contact sent waves of electricity through them both, reminding them of all the unresolved moments between them. "How's the gallery project going?" she asked, taking a seat in a nearby chair. The soft evening light streamed in through the container's windows, creating dancing shadows on the architectural plans spread out on the table. "Almost finished, but I'd like your opinion on a few details." He passed the plans to her, watching her eyes light up as she examined the spaces that would soon house her dreams. As they discussed the final adjustments, the sun set over Hongdae, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange reminiscent of their first meeting. In the streets below, street artists began their nightly performances, adding an impromptu soundtrack to the moment. "Sometimes I wonder," Jisoo began, his voice low and contemplative, "if this is all just an elaborate dream, if I'm going to wake up tomorrow and find that Sweet Haven is just another demolished building." Menjae stood up, approaching the window where she now stood. "It's not a dream," he said softly. "It's a promise I intend to keep, not just for the neighborhood, but for you too." The silence that followed was full of possibilities. Through the window, they could see Sweet Haven lit up, its restored facade shining like a beacon of hope in the changing neighborhood. Men Seo and her mother were still inside, their silhouettes visible as they worked together, rebuilding not just a business but a family. "I think I finally understand," Jisoo said, turning to face him. "Why you fought so hard for this place. It wasn't just about preserving a building or a business. It was about preserving stories," Menjae added, his eyes meeting hers. "And maybe creating some new ones too." News of the Hongdae district's transformation spread quickly through the Korean media. MJ Group's project had become a case study in sustainable urban development, attracting the attention of entrepreneurs and cultural preservationists from all over Asia. On a particularly busy morning, Jisoo was photographing the installation of Sweet Haven's new sign, a piece that blended the original vintage design with modern LED lighting. While adjusting his lens, he noticed a familiar figure watching the scene from across the street. "Park Hyun-woo," she murmured, recognizing the famous architecture critic. His latest article on urban gentrification had caused waves in the real estate sector. Menjae, who was supervising the installation, also noticed the critic's presence. "He came earlier than expected," he commented, approaching Jisoo. "I invited him to see the project." Hyun-woo's presence at Sweet Haven created a quiet buzz. Men Seo, who was finalizing the new menu with Seojun, nervously straightened her apron. Mrs. Park, however, maintained her characteristic calm, approaching the critic with a warm smile. "Welcome to Sweet Haven," she greeted him, guiding him to his favorite table by the window. "Allow me to serve you our new special blend." While the critic observed every detail of the environment, Menjae presented the elements of the revitalization project. The original floor plans were displayed alongside the proposed changes, showing how each alteration had been designed to preserve the essence of the place. "Interesting," Hyun-woo commented, his keen eyes noticing the photographs of Jisoo on the walls. "You're not just preserving a building, you're documenting a cultural transformation." The conversation was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of June, who was carrying an old briefcase. "I found more of Dad's documents," he announced, placing yellow drawings of projects that had never been completed on the table. Hyun-woo leaned over the papers with interest. "Kim Sung-ho," he murmured, recognizing the signature. "I worked with him at the start of my career. He always talked about humanizing urban development." The revelation of this unexpected connection brought a new dimension to the project. As they examined the old drawings, Jisoo discreetly captured that moment of discovery, his photographs recording the expressions of surprise and recognition. Mencio approached with a tray of freshly baked pastries, a fusion of traditional recipes with a contemporary presentation. "My mother always says that some stories are best told through flavors," she commented, serving the critic. The afternoon progressed with Hian Wu exploring every aspect of the project. He talked to local shopkeepers, observed the restoration work in progress, and made detailed notes in his black-bound notebook. "You know," he said to Minjae as they watched the sunset from the cafe's new outdoor area, "when I received the invitation to assess this project, I expected to find yet another case of superficial modernization, but you've achieved something rare here, a balance between preservation and progress." Jisoo, who was organizing his photos from the day on his laptop nearby, couldn't help but overhear the conversation. His pictures told the story of this transformation: smiling faces of old residents getting to know the improvements, street artists performing in new spaces dedicated to urban art, Mrs. Park and Mencio working side by side in the renovated kitchen. After Hian Wu left, promising to return for the official opening, Menjae met Jisoo in the new exhibition area that was being finished. The still empty white walls awaited the photographs that would tell the story of Sweet Haven. "He specifically asked to see your work at the opening," Menjae commented, watching her select images on her computer. "He said that your photographs capture the soul of the project." Jisoo blushed slightly, but remained focused on her work. "It's easy to capture beauty when it's everywhere," she replied, pausing on one particular photo. Menjae and Juno examining their father's drawings, their expressions softened by mutual understanding. The sound of laughter coming from the kitchen caught her attention. Seo-jun was teaching Mencio how to make the house's traditional cookies, while Mrs. Park supervised with evident pride. The scene perfectly captured the essence of what they had achieved: the union of past and present, tradition and innovation. "Sometimes I wonder," Menjae said softly, "if our parents somehow knew this would happen, if all those years of separate stories were just waiting for the right moment to intertwine." Jisoo lowered his camera, allowing himself to absorb the moment without the filter of the lens. "Maybe some stories need time to find their true meaning," she replied, her eyes meeting his. The opening of the renovated Sweet Haven was approaching, and the excitement in Hongdae was palpable. Park Hyun-woo's article on the revitalization project had generated a wave of international interest, turning the small cafe into a symbol of urban cultural preservation. Jisoo was walking through the neighborhood carrying his camera equipment when he noticed a group of architecture students sketching the facade of Sweet Haven. One of them was animatedly explaining how the project had managed to maintain the historic essence of the building while incorporating contemporary elements. "It's amazing how this place has become the subject of study," commented Mencio, approaching with shopping bags for the cafe. "Yesterday I received an email from a university in Tokyo asking to include our history in a course on urban revitalization." Inside Sweet Haven, Mrs. Park was overseeing the final adjustments to the decor. The walls now told the story of the place through a photographic timeline, starting with sepia images from the 1950s to Jisoo's colorful and vibrant photographs of the present. "Each photograph is like a window into a different moment," observed Seo-jun, pausing from his work in the kitchen to admire the exhibition. "It's as if the past and the present are talking through them." Menjae arrived in the middle of the afternoon, bringing with him a surprise: the old manual coffee grinder that his father had used in his first ventures. "I found it in the company storeroom," he explained, carefully placing the object on the restored counter. "I thought it could be part of the exhibition." The gesture touched everyone deeply, especially June, who was helping with the final administrative details. "Dad used to say that the first coffee of the day had to be ground by hand," he recalled, a nostalgic smile on his face. He said that the manual effort adds a special flavor. The afternoon progressed when an unexpected visitor arrived: Kim Young-mi, a former customer who had moved to the United States decades ago. She had read about the renovation online and scheduled her trip to coincide with the opening. "I met my husband here," she excitedly told Jisoo, who was recording her testimony. "He spilled coffee on my white dress. Mrs. Park helped us clean up, and well, the rest is history." While photographing the emotional reunion between Youngmi and Mrs. Park, Jisoo noticed Menjae watching the scene with a pensive expression. He approached him, lowering the camera for a moment. "What are you thinking about?" "About how places like this are more than just businesses," he replied softly. "They're keepers of memories, catalysts for stories. It took me so long to understand that." The sound of laughter coming from the kitchen attracted his attention. Mensio was trying to teach June how to make the house specialty cappuccino, resulting in an unsuccessful cloud of foam that partially covered his impeccable suit. "Some executives need to learn that not everything can be controlled," joked Mensio, helping him wipe his face with a napkin. The chemistry between the two did not go unnoticed by Jisoo, who discreetly captured the moment on his camera. It was yet another of the many unexpected stories that Sweet Haven was weaving. As the sun set, casting golden shadows through the new Art Deco windows, the team gathered for one last meeting before the grand opening. Mrs. Park served coffee to everyone using Minji's father's old coffee grinder. "To new beginnings," she toasted, built on old foundations. Menjae watched Jisoo photographing the moment and realized how his view of the world had changed since that rainy night when she had saved him. The camera in his hands was not just a tool for recording moments, but a way of preserving the soul of places and people. "The photos for the inaugural exhibition are ready," Jisoo announced, connecting his laptop to one of the new screens installed on the walls. The images began to scroll by, telling the story of the transformation, not only of the physical space, but of the people involved. One photograph in particular caught everyone's attention. It showed Menjae and Juno examining their father's drawings next to Mrs. Park and Mensio, who were sharing a cup of coffee. The natural light coming through the window created an effect that seemed to blend past and present. "That's it," Mensio whispered. "The essence of what we've built here." The evening progressed with the final preparations, every detail being carefully checked. The new external lighting was tested, creating a play of light that highlighted the building's preserved architecture. The aroma of freshly roasted coffee and cakes coming out of the oven filled the air, mixing with the Hongdae night breeze. When everyone had left, Minjae found Jisoo in the new gallery, organizing the last photographs for the exhibition. The once empty space now told stories on every wall, each image a testament to the power of preserving and transforming simultaneously. "You know," he said, coming closer, "I think I've finally understood what my father meant about inspiration in small moments." The day of the inauguration dawned with a different energy in Hongdae. Hundreds of people crowded in front of the renovated Sweet Haven, eager to witness the transformation that had captured the city's imagination. International journalists mingled with the locals, their cameras ready to document the historic moment. At the back of the cafe, Jisoo was adjusting the last photographs for her exhibition when she heard a conversation that made her stop. It was Minjae on the phone, his voice full of emotion. "Yes, Grandma. I finally found Dad's letters," he said. He was right about Sweet Haven. He wrote about this place in his last days. The revelation made Jisoo freeze. Approaching silently, she saw Menjae holding a bundle of yellowed letters, his hands trembling slightly as he reread them. "We need to show these to Mrs. Park," he muttered when he noticed Jisoo's presence. "These are letters my father wrote about how Sweet Haven inspired him to start MJ Group. He came here every morning before he opened his first office." In the kitchen, Mensio and Seo Jun were coordinating an expanded team of pastry chefs, preparing a fusion of traditional and contemporary recipes for the opening. The aroma of coffee and pastries filled the air, mixing with the anticipation of the moment. "I found another letter," Jun announced, hurrying in. His impeccable suit contrasted with the agitation on his face. "It's addressed to Mrs. Park, dated a week before her father's death." Mrs. Park, who was overseeing the final preparations, sat down as she read the contents. Kim Sung-ho's words revealed a deeper connection that no one had imagined. He had promised to protect Sweet Haven, but had never had the chance to keep his promise. "So that's why," she whispered, silent tears streaming down her face. "Your father always said that one day he would repay you for the coffee that kept him awake during his nights of planning." The discovery added a new layer of meaning to the celebration. It wasn't just about preserving a historic building or modernizing a family business. It was about honoring promises made across generations. As the time for the inauguration drew closer, Jisoo captured every moment through his lens. His exhibition would now include a special section dedicated to the connection between the Kim and Park families, a web of destiny woven with coffee, dreams, and perseverance. "People are coming," Min Seo announced, adjusting her personalized apron that mixed elements of Sweet Haven and Sweet Dreams. The line outside stretched for blocks. Min-jae climbed onto the small stage set up in front of the cafe, his brother by his side. The transformation in their relationship was visible to everyone who met them. Where once there was competition, now there was complicity. "Today we're not just celebrating the renovation of a space," Min-jae began his speech, his voice clear and emotional. "We celebrate the renewal of bonds, the discovery of connections that have always existed, just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves." Mrs. Park and Min Seo were called to the stage, representing the union between tradition and innovation. Their intertwined hands symbolized more than a family reconciliation. They were living testimony that change and preservation could coexist harmoniously. As Sweet Haven's doors officially opened, Jisoo captured the reactions of the first visitors. Their expressions of surprise and delight as they discovered how each element of the space told a different story. From the restored floor to the new art installations on the ceiling, the photo gallery, now called Memories in Grain, attracted particular attention. Jisoo's images, arranged chronologically, narrated not only the physical transformation of the space, but the emotional journey of everyone involved. "You've managed to capture the soul of the place," Park Hyun-woo commented, examining a particular photograph showing Min-jae and Juno discovering their father's letters. Each image is a window into a moment of truth. As the day progressed, Sweet Haven pulsed with new lives. Old customers mingled with new ones, sharing stories about the significance of the place in their lives. Mrs. Park, watching everything from her usual chair, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who sees a dream not only preserved, but expanded. "Do you know what impresses me the most?" Seo-jun commented to Jisoo as he poured another round of coffee. "How each person who comes in here seems to find a piece of themselves in the stories we tell." The sun was beginning to set when Min-jae met Jisoo in the gallery, both exhausted but fulfilled. The city lights were beginning to glow, reflecting in Sweet Haven's restored windows. "I haven't finished telling this story yet," she said, adjusting her camera for another click. "Some stories," Min-jae replied softly, "never really end. They just get new chapters." And there, between photographs that told stories of loss and reconnection, of old promises and new beginnings, something deeper than words began to take shape between them. Sweet Haven was celebrating its first anniversary since the renovation, and the streets of Hongdae pulse with a special energy. The revitalization project had inspired similar transformations in other historic districts of Seoul, creating a cultural preservation movement that was spreading throughout the city. Jisoo was organizing his first solo exhibition in the gallery attached to the cafe. Grains of Time brought together photographs that documented not only the physical transformation of the space, but the human stories that intertwined there. Among the images, a special series showed the letters exchanged between Kim Sung-ho and the Park family, revealing a connection that transcended generations. "It's amazing how some stories need time to be fully told," remarked Min Seo, now creative director of the new coffee shop chain that merged the Sweet Haven and Sweet Dreams concepts. Mrs. Park, who was overseeing preparations for the anniversary celebration, smiled as she watched her daughter chatting animatedly with June about expansion plans. The unexpected romance between them had blossomed naturally, like well-grown coffee. Who knew that starched executive would learn to make the best cappuccino in the house? Joked Seo-jun, who now ran a training program for young chefs, perpetuating Sweet Haven's culinary traditions. Min-jae entered the gallery carrying an old package found in the MJ Group archives. "I thought this should be part of the exhibition," he said, handing Jisoo a photo album from the early days of his father's company. The images showed Kim Sung-ho in his youth, always with a cup of Sweet Haven in hand, planning the empire he would build. In one particular photo, he appeared chatting with Mrs. Park's father, both smiling over architectural plans that now, decades later, had finally materialized. "It's as if they knew," Jisoo murmured, arranging the new photographs in the exhibition, "as if they were planting seeds for a future they wouldn't see, but believed in." The neighborhood's transformation had attracted international attention. Students of architecture and urban development came from all over the world to study how the renovation had preserved the soul of the place while modernizing it. Sweet Haven became a case study in cultural sustainability. The real success is not in the numbers, Min Jae often explained in talks about the project, but in the way we manage to preserve and strengthen the bonds that make a community. The evening of celebration brought together hundreds of people. Customers old and new, locals, street artists and business people mingled naturally, sharing stories about what Sweet Haven has meant in their lives. Park Hyun-woo returned for a new report, this time focusing on the project's social impact. "What you've created here goes beyond architectural preservation," he commented, observing the diversity of people crowding the space. "It's a model of how development can strengthen, rather than destroy, the social fabric of a city." Mrs. Park, in her emotional speech, spoke about cycles and new beginnings. "This coffee shop has always been more than a business," she said, her voice charged with emotion. "It's a place where stories meet, where the past is not forgotten, but embraced as a foundation for the future." June and Mensio announced the expansion of the concept to other historic neighborhoods, always maintaining the essence of preservation and community. Each new unit would be unique, adapted to the local history and culture of the place where it would be established. As the celebration continued, Jisoo met Min Jae in Mrs. Park's old office, now transformed into a small museum telling the story of the Kim and Park families. "Do you remember the night we met?" she asked, adjusting her camera to capture the reflection of the city lights in the framed photographs. "How could I forget?" Min Jae smiled, his eyes meeting hers through the camera's viewfinder. "You saved me in so many different ways that night." The sound of laughter and music floated through the restored windows, mixing with the aroma of the special coffee created for the occasion, a blend that combined beans traditionally used by Sweet Haven with new roasting methods developed by Mensio. "Some stories never end," Jisoo reflected, lowering his camera to face Min Jae directly. "They just keep changing, like the aroma of coffee that changes as it cools, revealing new nuances." Min Jae took his hand gently, their intertwined fingers telling their own story of transformation and discovery. Together, they walked to the renovated balcony, looking out over the neighborhood they had helped to preserve and reinvent. Sweet Haven shone in the Hongdae night, not just as a successful business or preservation project, but as a living testament to how love for a place, for a story, for people can transform and be transformed, creating something new without losing the essence of what came before. And so, while a new generation of dreamers found their place at Sweet Haven's tables, history continued to develop, like coffee beans carefully cultivated, harvested and transformed into something that warms the soul and nourishes dreams. The evening progressed with the final preparations, every detail being carefully checked. The new external lighting was tested, creating a play of light that highlighted the building's preserved architecture. The aroma of freshly roasted coffee and cakes coming out of the oven filled the air, mixing with the Hongdae night breeze. When everyone had left, Min Jae found Jisoo in the new gallery, organizing the last photographs for the exhibition. The once empty space now told stories on every wall, each image a testament to the power of preserving and transforming simultaneously. "You know," he said, coming closer, "I think I finally understood what my father meant about inspiration in small moments." The day of the inauguration dawned with a different energy in Hongdae. Hundreds of people crowded in front of the renovated Sweet Haven, eager to witness the transformation that had captured the city's imagination. International journalists mingled with the locals, their cameras ready to document the historic moment. At the back of the cafe, Jisoo was adjusting the last photographs for her exhibition when she heard a conversation that made her stop. It was Min Jae on the phone, his voice full of emotion. "Yes, Grandma. I finally found Dad's letters," he said. He was right about Sweet Haven. He wrote about this place in his last days. The revelation made Jisoo freeze. Approaching silently, she saw Min Jae holding a bundle of yellowed letters, his hands trembling slightly as he reread them. "We need to show these to Mrs. Park," he muttered when he noticed Jisoo's presence. "These are letters my father wrote about how Sweet Haven inspired him to start MJ Group. He came here every morning before he opened his first office." In the kitchen, Mensio and Seo Jun were coordinating an expanded team of pastry chefs, preparing a fusion of traditional and contemporary recipes for the opening. The aroma of coffee and pastries filled the air, mixing with the anticipation of the moment. "I found another letter," June announced, hurrying in. His impeccable suit contrasted with the agitation on his face. "It's addressed to Mrs. Park, dated a week before her father's death." Mrs. Park, who was overseeing the final preparations, sat down as she read the contents. Kim Sung-ho's words revealed a deeper connection that no one had imagined. He had promised to protect Sweet Haven, but had never had the chance to keep his promise. "So that's why," she whispered, silent tears streaming down her face. "Your father always said that one day he would repay you for the coffee that kept him awake during his nights of planning." The discovery added a new layer of meaning to the celebration. It wasn't just about preserving a historic building or modernizing a family business. It was about honoring promises made across generations. As the time for the inauguration drew closer, Jisoo captured every moment through his lens. His exhibition would now include a special section dedicated to the connection between the Kim and Park families, a web of destiny woven with coffee, dreams, and perseverance. "People are coming," Min Seo announced, adjusting her personalized apron that mixed elements of Sweet Haven and Sweet Dreams. The line outside stretched for blocks. Min Jae climbed onto the small stage set up in front of the cafe, his brother by his side. The transformation in their relationship was visible to everyone who met them. Where once there was competition, now there was complicity. "Today we're not just celebrating the renovation of a space," Min Jae began his speech, his voice clear and emotional. "We celebrate the renewal of bonds, the discovery of connections that have always existed, just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves." Mrs. Park and Min Seo were called to the stage, representing the union between tradition and innovation. Their intertwined hands symbolized more than a family reconciliation. They were living testimony that change and preservation could coexist harmoniously. As Sweet Haven's doors officially opened, Jisoo captured the reactions of the first visitors. Their expressions of surprise and delight as they discovered how each element of the space told a different story, from the restored floor to the new art installations on the ceiling. The photo gallery, now called Memories in Grain, attracted particular attention. Jisoo's images, arranged chronologically, narrated not only the physical transformation of the space, but the emotional journey of everyone involved. "You've managed to capture the soul of the place," Park Hyun-woo commented, examining a particular photograph showing Min Jae and Juno discovering their father's letters. Each image is a window into a moment of truth. As the day progressed, Sweet Haven pulsed with new life. Old customers mingled with new ones, sharing stories about the significance of the place in their lives. Mrs. Park, watching everything from her usual chair, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who sees a dream not only preserved, but expanded. "Do you know what impresses me the most?" Seo Jun commented to Jisoo as he poured another round of coffee. "How each person who comes in here seems to find a piece of themselves in the stories we tell." The sun was beginning to set when Min Jae met Jisoo in the gallery, both exhausted but fulfilled. The city lights were beginning to glow, reflecting in Sweet Haven's restored windows. "I haven't finished telling this story yet," she said, adjusting her camera for another click. "Some stories," Min Jae replied softly, "never really end. They just get new chapters." And there, between photographs that told stories of loss and reconnection, of old promises and new beginnings, something deeper than words began to take shape between them. Sweet Haven was celebrating its first anniversary since the renovation, and the streets of Hongdae pulsed with the special energy. The revitalization project had inspired similar transformations in other historic districts of Seoul, creating a cultural preservation movement that was spreading throughout the city. Jisoo was organizing his first solo exhibition in the gallery attached to the cafe. Grains of Time brought together photographs that documented not only the physical transformation of the space, but the human stories that intertwined there. Among the images, a special series showed the letters exchanged between Kim Sung-ho and the Park family, revealing a connection that transcended generations. "It's amazing how some stories need time to be fully told," remarked Min Seo, now creative director of the new coffee shop chain that merged the Sweet Haven and Sweet Dreams concepts. Mrs. Park, who was overseeing preparations for the anniversary celebration, smiled as she watched her daughter chatting animatedly with June about expansion plans. The unexpected romance between them had blossomed naturally, like well-grown coffee. Who knew that stashed executive would learn to make the best cappuccino in the house? Joked Seo Jun, who now ran a training program for young chefs, perpetuating Sweet Haven's culinary traditions. Min-jae entered the gallery carrying an old package found in the MJ Group archives. "I thought this should be part of the exhibition," he said, handing Jisoo a photo album from the early days of his father's company. The images showed Kim Sung-ho in his youth, always with a cup of Sweet Haven in hand, planning the empire he would build. In one particular photo, he appeared chatting with Mrs. Park's father, both smiling over architectural plans that now, decades later, had finally materialized. "It's as if they knew," Jisoo murmured, arranging the new photographs in the exhibition, "as if they were planting seeds for a future they wouldn't see, but believed in." The neighborhood's transformation had attracted international attention. Students of architecture and urban development came from all over the world to study how the renovation had preserved the soul of the place while modernizing it. Sweet Haven became a case study in cultural sustainability. "The real success is not in the numbers," Min-jae often explained in talks about the project, "but in the way we manage to preserve and strengthen the bonds that make a community." The evening of celebration brought together hundreds of people. Customers old and new, locals, street artists and business people mingled naturally, sharing stories about what Sweet Haven has meant in their lives. Park Hyun-woo returned for a new report, this time focusing on the project's social impact. "What you've created here goes beyond architectural preservation," he commented, observing the diversity of people crowding the space. "It's a model of how development can strengthen, rather than destroy, the social fabric of a city." Mrs. Park, in her emotional speech, spoke about cycles and new beginnings. "This coffee shop has always been more than a business," she said, her voice charged with emotion. "It's a place where stories meet, where the past is not forgotten, but embraced as a foundation for the future." June and Min-seo announced the expansion of the concept to other historic neighborhoods, always maintaining the essence of preservation and community. Each new unit would be unique, adapted to the local history and culture of the place where it would be established. As the celebration continued, Jisoo met Min-jae in Mrs. Park's old office, now transformed into a small museum telling the story of the Kim and Park families. "Do you remember the night we met?" she asked, adjusting her camera to capture the reflection of the city lights in the framed photographs. "How could I forget?" Min-jae smiled, his eyes meeting hers through the camera's viewfinder. "You saved me in so many different ways that night." The sound of laughter and music floated through the restored windows, mixing with the aroma of the special coffee created for the occasion, a blend that combined beans traditionally used by Sweet Haven with new roasting methods developed by Min-seo. "Some stories never end," Jisoo reflected, lowering his camera to face Min-jae directly. "They just keep changing, like the aroma of coffee that changes as it cools, revealing new nuances." Min-jae took his hand gently, their intertwined fingers telling their own story of transformation and discovery. Together, they walked to the renovated balcony, looking out over the neighborhood they had helped to preserve and reinvent. Sweet Haven shone in the Hongdae night, not just as a successful business or preservation project, but as a living testament to how love for a place, for a story, for people can transform and be transformed, creating something new without losing the essence of what came before. And so, while a new generation of dreamers found their place at Sweet Haven's tables, history continued to develop, like coffee beans carefully cultivated, harvested and transformed into something that warms the soul and nourishes dreams.